What if the language you spoke carried the weight of empires? What if every word you wrote echoed through the halls of kings, and every line became a thread in the fabric of civilization? Over 2,000 years ago, a dynasty rose from the ashes of war and forged not only roads and armies, but something far more enduring, an evolving system of thought, recorded in characters, sung in verse, and bound in silk and bamboo. This is the story of that dynasty. This is the story of the Han. But to understand how the Han would come to define what it meant to be Chinese, we must first step back to the brief, burning reign of the dynasty that unified China and then vanished like smoke. That is the Qin dynasty, who also were an extremely impressive dynasty, but only lasted 221 to 206 BCE, 15 years. It unified China to end the Warring States era. They are also the ones to start building the Great Wall. Qin Shi Huang was the first emperor of China, a pivotal figure in Chinese history. He decreed the standardization of weights, measures, developed currency, and unified the writing system. This began the dynasties of imperial China that would last over 2,000 years until the Xinhai Revolution in 1911. This was a centralized government compared to the previous Zhou dynasty, which was a decentralized feudal system when nobles ruled their own territories. Qin Shi Huang's mausoleum took 38 years and 700,000 workers to build. It is a massive subterranean complex that is a replica of his capital. Protecting his tomb are a life-size terracotta army of 8,000 soldiers. This tomb is 100 by 75 meters, larger than an American football field, and remains unopened. The tomb is said to contain rivers of mercury, representing the Yangtze and Yellow Rivers, ceilings painted with stars and planets, lost technologies, booby traps, crossbows set to fire on those entering, spring-loaded poison darts, and collapsing corridors. When Qin Shi Huang died, his son proved a weak leader. The system had employed the harsh legalism political philosophy and excessive taxes. These factors, along with a diminished army, led to the overthrow. The Han Dynasty then existed 202 BCE to 220 CE in two parts. The Western Han, 206 BCE to 9 CE, and the Eastern Han, 25 CE to 220. Certainly this was a golden age. Chang'an was the capital of the Western Han. Luoyang was the capital of the Eastern Han. The Han Dynasty of China has often been compared to the Roman Empire in the West. They both emerged about the same time and lasted for centuries, expanded their empires immensely, developed a sophisticated bureaucracy, government infrastructure, an amazing road system, and both would build trade routes that would lead to one another despite being around 7,000 kilometers or over 4,000 miles apart. They both became the standard for future empires to compare themselves. The technological creation of the Han Dynasty included paper, drilling down 4,800 feet or close to 1,500 meters for mining purposes, the magnetic compass, the seismograph for measuring earthquakes, the wheelbarrow, the suspension bridges, the adjustable wrench, the stirrup for horse riding, and the rudder to direct boats. Another was an oil lamp that could focus the direction along with the intensity of the light and would trap smoke, an anti-pollution device. My imagination is forced to consider a visit back in time to the Han. I see it as something like this. I walked through the Han when the roads were wide with dust. I was no one of note, a stranger with sore feet, a man with a satchel of scrolls and a thirst for stories. But the empire welcomed me, as it did all who took to its roads. From the western gates of Chang'an, the city pulsed like a living heart, its markets full of foreign tongues and silks that whispered of desert moons. Officials in crimson robes moved like waves through marble halls, their speech laced with ritual, their eyes trained on heaven. The emperor was distant, but his presence stretched like mist over all that was Han. I slept in inns built by ancient timber, where merchants spoke of Rome as if it were only one stop down the road. They bartered sentiment for knowledge, lapis, the precious gemstone, for silk, while I traded my silence for their tales. In the villages, elders poured tea with hands that remembered the Qin Empire. I heard stories of how Emperor Wu sent armies to tame the wild north and envoys westward to find allies in the lands beyond the sands. I climbed mountains to reach Taoist hermits who read the world in cloud patterns and river stones. They spoke of the Tao, the way, not as a place, but as a current one must float upon, not paddle against. They lived with little and yet owned the stars. In Luoyang, I watched scholars bowed to the Confucian classics, debating not to conquer, but to refine, to shape the soul of the state with ink instead of iron. Children recited works of virtue. I stood on the banks of the Yellow River, where farmers turned the earth with tools forged of Han iron, their sweat building the empire as surely as any general. They spoke little, but when they looked up from the soil, they looked towards eternity. Yet even I, a wanderer, could feel the cracks beneath the beauty. Bandits in the hills, corruption behind the curtain, eunuchs with daggers, and rebels whose songs echoed louder than the bells of court. Still, even as shadows lengthened, the Han held its dignity like an aging lion, proud, knowing its greatness was not in conquest alone, but in how it carved order from chaos, how it bound 100 peoples with roads, rituals, and rhythm. I left the Han behind me, but it never left me. Its roads run through my memory. Its wisdom clings like incense to the robes I wore in my visit. It was not perfect. No empire is. But in its breath, I felt the heartbeat of a civilization that believed in the balance of heaven and man, in the poetry of law, in the silence between stars. I was just a traveler, but the Han made me a witness to the spectacular. The Han descended from a confederation of tribes living along the Yellow River, fairly close to Beijing, during the Warring States era, 475 BCE to 221 BCE. The Han today are the largest ethnic group in the world. During the Han Dynasty, Confucian scholars put together what is known as the 5 classics. These were to be a foundation for Chinese education, for civil service exams, for emperors. These were the core tenets of the state ideology and were guides for the common people. A few hundred years before this, Confucius, it is said, had compiled, organized, and edited these, probably along with some of his followers. These 5 in particularly were more organized and named during the Han Dynasty. Each of the 5 classics is a collection of works. These include the Classic of Poetry, Book of Documents, Book of Rites, I Ching, and Spring and Autumn Annals. Classic of Poetry is a collection of 305 poems that date back to the Western Zhou period, 1046 to 771 BCE, and possibly even earlier. These poems are about social, political, and cultural life at the time. One of the poems is titled Gathering Vetch. The poem is about a soldier who has been away from home for years at war. He longs for his wife to return to his village and shares the harsh realities of war. It is one of literature's first anti-war pieces. The classic of poetry is divided into 3 parts. Gathering Vetch is found in the airing of the states part, where it is said, the Chinese learned to weep, to sing, to remember. Book of Documents served as the foundation for Chinese political philosophy for 2,000 years. It is a group of speeches by political leaders and various state documents. One famous quote in the Book of Documents comes from King Tang, who in 1600 BCE brought down the Han Dynasty and established the Shang Dynasty. His words state, "Heaven sees as the people see. Heaven hears as the people hear. The crimes of the Shah ruler are numerous and offensive to heaven. I, Tang, have dared to act not out of desire for conquest, but to deliver the people from suffering. Let me not forget, if I grow proud and oppressive, heaven will turn against me, as it did against the Shah ruler, G." The Book of Rights was about the rights of the Zhou dynasty, China's longest-lasting dynasty from 1046 to 256 BCE, 789 years. It is about society in general, government structure, and rituals of the time. One part, named the Great Knowledge, remains an important part of Chinese philosophy, despite being well over 3,000 years old. One quote reads, "Peace does not begin in palaces or parliaments. It begins in the quiet chambers of the heart. When a person masters virtues, and therefore their self, their households then become whole. From a well-ordered household springs a just and stable state. And when a state is just, peace can be well known." Fu poetry began and flourished in the Han Dynasty, creating a golden age of literature, written in rich, ornate detail, showcasing a writer's scholarly knowledge in multiple areas with philosophical undertones. Often performed at court, Fu was both a poetic spectacle and a subtle vehicle for political insight. Sima Xiangru is known by many as the greatest of Fu writers, known for his long and ornate pieces filled with myth and grandeur. 2 of his well-known works are Fu on the Imperial Park and Fu on the Great Man. Emperor Wu commissioned Sima for Fu on the Imperial Park. Emperor Wu was one of the exceptional emperors in Chinese history, particularly in leadership ability and effective governance. The park, it was proclaimed in the poem, was one of the extensive grandeur. Exotic animals and plants were found there, mystical temples, and a place that everyday people would find unimaginable. On the Great Man is about a sage king, one who governs not by force, but by virtue and alignment of the Tao, or the way of the universe. Bangu, another of the most famous Fu writers, wrote Fu on the 2 capitals of Chang'an, of the Western Han, and Luoyang, later of the Eastern Han. He looked at the differences of the 2 capitals, life, and the politics involved in each. Yuefu songs, also originated in the Han Dynasty, were a look into the soul of the people. The songs were of hardships, lost loves, lost lives, and struggles of the common people. The Han court formed the music bureau, This was to collect and preserve these songs and archives. They would even add music to these songs. Yuefu would remain a common form of expression for hundreds and hundreds of years. One of these was the Ballad of Mulan, a couple to few hundred years after the Han Dynasty. This is what the Disney films of Mulan are based on. The basis of the story is a time when China is invaded by barbarians. A decree is made that every family would contribute at least one male member of the family to fight. Mulan is a daughter to a war hero who has grown old and is in poor health, but he will answer the call. Mulan, knowing the frailty of her father, goes into disguise as a male and volunteers in place of her father. Zhang Qian was sent on various missions to establish contact and to understand Central Asia. The trip was intended to establish and promote the Silk Route, which he did. He was sent by Emperor Wu in the 2nd century BCE. He made it to Afghanistan and saw the last of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, one of those created by Alexander the Great's generals. He also brought back information on the Parthians of what is today Iran, India, and other locations of Central Asia. The Silk Route would then exist for some 1700 years. Ban Chou, from the Bon family, which I'll cover shortly, was the commanding general of the west of China. China had lost a lot of territory to the west, and Bon gained better control of the Silk Route and some other routes. He sent envoys to explore Central Asia and beyond, including Gan Ying. Gan Ying was the first known Chinese to reach Europe. The information gathered by these envoys and beyond was put into a book which included information on the Roman Empire by Ban Yung, the son of Ban Chou. This was presented to the Emperor An during the beginning of the 2nd century CE. China would throughout the years compile collections of great works of their history. This was last done during the Ming Dynasty in 1775, titled 24 Histories. Records of a grand historian and the Book of Han were consistently included in these collections. Records of a Grand Historian was finished by Sima Qian around 91 BCE, after his father began it. This mammoth effort has 130 chapters, covering 2,500 years of Chinese history, up to Emperor Wu of the Han. The Book of Han was finished in 111 CE, about the history of Western Han, or the first of two parts of the Han Dynasty. The work was 100 volumes in length, and was the first Chinese source to mention Japan. Much of what is known now about this period is from this. The writers were from the Bon family, I mentioned above, a well-known family in history, starting with the king west of the Han lands, princes, several scholars, writers, famed military officers, and later, dynasty founders. The Book of Han was started by a Bon family member, historian and politician Ban Biao. Ban Biao, who was father to three of China's extraordinary people in history, in Ban Gu, Ban Chou, and Ban Chao. Ban Gu is the famous Fu writer mentioned above, who would take over the Book of Han when his father passed away. Ban Gu would make substantial contributions, but would not finish it. That was done by his sister, historian, philosopher, politician, astronomer, mathematician, poet, writer, and Taoist sexual instructor to the royal family. Ban Jiao, along with Pamphile, the ancient Greek, are credited as being the two earliest known women historians in the world. Ban Jiao also wrote Lessons for Women. In 1624, it became part of the Four Books for Women collection and stayed in wide circulation until the 20th century. The third sibling, Ban Chao, is mentioned above as the general and along with his son, presenter of information on the West all the way to the Roman Empire. Biography of Exemplary Women was written by polymath or a scholar on different subjects, Liu Xiang, in 18 BCE. The work looks at 125 accounts of exemplary women in ancient China who lived with exceptional Confucian values, were recognized for their intelligence, literary skills, compassion, wisdom, integrity, and rhetoric. Ancient Chinese texts are still being discovered in modern times. Ma Wangdui silk texts were discovered in 1973. These are a set of 28 different types of books on philosophy, medicine, warfare strategy, mathematics, astrology, astronomy, and other subjects. They contain the earliest known copies of I Ching, Tao Te Ching, and some other books unknown before the discovery. This was all written on silk and placed in a tomb, sealed in 168 BCE. In 1972, construction workers discovered ancient bamboo shoots with writing on them at the base of Yankeishan Mountain. These were buried in 2 tombs during the Han Dynasty 2100 or 2200 years ago. They contain many writings that were unknown, lost but known, and also known ones. Burial paintings were common during the Han Dynasty. Many of these have survived to this day with scenes of everyday life, historical narratives, and officials from the time. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.